everyone. I am going to get started. My name is DeeDee Lavinder, and I'm very excited to be here. I was an attendee of We Rise many years ago, and I'm super glad to be back at the iteration now that we know as Refactor Tech. So I currently work as an engineering manager at a company called Zip. I've worked in technology for the past 8 or so years. Most of that time was spent as a back-end engineer. My background before tech is somewhat eclectic. I've worked in several other industries, including construction and trucking. My most recent professional endeavor before coding was opening and then operating a brick and mortar retail store for children and their families. So imagine my transition from cute little baby clothes to Jira and intense discussions about code editors. There were more than a few things that were tough in that transition. Some were expected. I knew about the lack of overall diversity in tech related to skin color, gender, age, parental status. Some things were unexpected. Pizza was incredibly hard to avoid. Before the pandemic, pizza was at every tech meetup, lunch and learn, etc. Another unexpectedly not fun thing that I discovered in joining the world of tech was meetings. So compared to my previous jobs, there are a lot of meetings in tech. On the one hand, that isn't a bad thing. We need to build shared understanding. We need to plan and prepare. We want to be informed and connected. On the other hand, how many meetings actually effectively accomplish those goals? I have been to so many awful meetings in tech. I'm curious, in the last 2 weeks, how many of you have been to a meeting with no agenda? That's a lot of hands. How many of you have been to a meeting in which you did not speak or otherwise contribute? How about a meeting that should have been an email or you probably could have skipped? This is just the last 2 weeks, right? I wish I could have all those many hours back when I sat in an hour-long engineering meeting when only 3 or 4 people spoke the entire time and the meeting ended without a single action item or clear decision. At first, I thought, I'm new to the industry. When I know more, I'll contribute. Then I realized there were several people in those meetings who knew way more than I did and also were not contributing. So I started trying to understand what was going on. Because here's the thing. In my life before and currently outside of technology, I regularly facilitate amazing group discussions all the time. They're interesting, even fun, and consistently have a 100% participation rate. And they're extremely productive. It is true. I volunteer as a sexuality educator for children, mostly 5th graders and their families, using a curriculum called OWL, which stands for Our Whole Lives. 5th graders are amazing. Now, we cover lots of topics, many of which are awkward or even difficult. And families each come with their own unique mix of values, characteristics, communication styles, and even concerns. Now layer that with the individual personalities, the experiences of the children and their parents or caregivers. Some are shy, some are nervous, some are opinionated, some are talkers, some are not happy. Actually, this sounds like I could be describing a group of developers on engineering teams. So that leads us back to meetings in tech. Now, through the years, despite all the awful meetings, there were a handful of good, even great meetings. And guess what made the difference? Every time, it was the moderator. The person leading the meeting was what always made the difference. So while my experience as a moderator and facilitator was growing outside of tech, my experience as a participant in tech was also growing. And I started to analyze what was working and what wasn't. So one thing that really stood out to me was the difference between the level of engagement and the sense of belonging that I noticed between the OWL participants and the engineers. In OWL sessions, moderators work hard to make sure the participants know their opinion matters and the group will benefit from each individual's contribution. Building trust is a key objective from the very first meeting. Back in tech meetings, this was hardly happening, if at all. And I thought about who wasn't contributing. The person that gave the most thoughtful PR reviews, the one everyone wanted to discuss their work with, the engineer that wrote such amazing code you were inspired to study it, the person on the team with a really unique background, the person who had been there the longest, the person who had just joined and had the freshest perspective. The cost of not hearing the possible contributions from everyone in a meeting is something to consider deeply. The cost of making anyone feel excluded or like they don't belong is too high a price to ignore. I'm convinced that poorly run meetings reduce your team's overall productivity and damage folks' sense of belonging. So today, we're going to dive into the role of the moderator. The meeting leader, the facilitator. This role is critical, and I believe carries the responsibility for the outcome of the meeting. I'm going to say that again. This role carries the responsibility for the outcome of the meeting. In the same way we expect teachers to utilize a variety of tools and techniques for teaching, we don't ask children to adjust their learning style. Putting the burden of the meeting outcome on participants is a recipe for failure. The moderator bears the burden of creating an atmosphere where each person feels their contributions matter and they are comfortable participating. Now, this all starts way before the meeting starts. And I would say it starts even before planning the meeting. To craft an inclusive meeting, an effective moderator needs a wide range of tools and techniques to creatively engage everyone in the meeting. So let's start with what I like to call the moderator's toolbox. Now, your goal as the moderator is to remove any and all barriers to participation. To do this, you need to consider psychological barriers. There may also be physical or logistic barriers, and we'll discuss that in a bit. But for now, I want you to consider that you may not know or be able to know all the factors that are possibly holding folks back from contributing. It could be that they're shy or suffering from imposter syndrome or feeling insecure about their level of experience or knowledge about a certain subject. Acknowledge that you may not know or understand participants' background, emotional state, or even interest level. There are also the power dynamics, or maybe politics, that may be at play in your team or organization. Being curious and interested in the psychological barriers that keep some folks from participating is critical for a strong moderator's work to level the playing field for contributing as much as you can. Now, this is an interesting expression, to level the playing field. It has its origins in sports and is now widely used to basically mean creating a state in which conditions are equitable for everyone. As the moderator of a meeting, this means you want to make space for folks who are less likely to contribute, and you want to encourage those who tend to dominate meetings towards more inclusive behavior. Considering psychological barriers is a great place to start thinking about how to level the playing field. And there's another critical aspect for moderators to consider. Let's jump out of the moderator's toolbox for a few minutes and talk about introverts and extroverts. Now, I'd like to share that I'm an extreme introvert. This is basically me. To be clear, introverts are not necessarily shy. And in fact, there are shy extroverts. Many introverts like people. I do, just not all of you at once. One-on-one, I could probably talk to you for hours. I actually love people, not large groups of people, and I don't like small talk. In conversations, I'm hoping to get to the deep stuff as soon as possible. My standard party agenda is to find at least one interesting person as early as possible, talk to them about anything and everything they have an interest or energy in talking about, and then I find the exit. Susan Cain wrote a book called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And this book changed the way I thought about my introversion. It helped me acknowledge our culture's extrovert bias and think about ways to work around that. It also had a huge impact on my work as a facilitator. I'd like to share a few key takeaways that have informed some of my strong opinions about moderators and meetings. So here are some attributes of introverts and extroverts. You might have a sense of which of these best describes you, and as with most classifications, it's really more of a spectrum than an either-or. Understanding that your team or group is absolutely comprised of folks that fall all along this spectrum, and understanding how to best engage them in a group setting will definitely level up your skills as a moderator. While most people are likely not on the extreme ends of this spectrum, as a culture, we definitely have extrovert bias. Just read these and see what you think. As with most biases, this may be hard to face, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. As a moderator, we're trying to combat this bias and make space for everyone's voice to be heard. I promise you, you want to know what the introverts around you are thinking. More than that, you and your team can greatly benefit from all they have to contribute. They say if you want to know what an extrovert is thinking, you just have to listen. If you want to know what an introvert is thinking, you have to ask. A processing formula for extroverts is to talk, think, and then talk some more. For introverts, we're going to think before we talk, and then we're going to think some more if we have managed to talk. Strategies for maximizing input from those quiet thinkers on your team inform many of the tools in our moderator's toolbox. Let's jump back into it. So we've talked about considering psychological barriers that may impede participation. We talked about leveling the playing field. Now, all of these categories in the moderator's toolbox are somewhat interrelated and/or overlapping. But let's talk next about developing a wide range of techniques for encouraging participation. This is a huge bucket, and I'll cover a few things that I have tried and refined over the years. If you have other techniques you've used or witnessed, I would love to hear about them afterward. I'm always adding ideas and tools to my moderator toolbox. Now, one of my standard go-tos for encouraging and increasing participation is to use anonymity whenever possible. This will go further than you think. Maybe you want to hear what folks think about a new process that's been implemented. Would you rather have a small pool of feedback from a handful of folks that you know? Or would you rather have anonymized feedback from every person that the process impacts? Being able to give anonymous feedback also makes it more likely that the feedback you get will be transparent and genuine. So how do you do this? There are techniques for both virtual meetings and in-person meetings. When you're in person, have note cards or sticky notes and pens that are all the same color. When you're in a virtual meeting, use online digital products or apps that support anonymity, like Jamboard or Retrium, and there are many others. Now, another standby strategy of mine is to utilize small groups. Remember how I said only a few people talked during those hour-long meetings I described earlier? If your group is larger than 5 to 8 people, it's going to be tricky to get everyone participating. The ideal size for a small group discussion is between 3 to 5 people. Now, the larger the group, the longer amount of time is needed for everyone to be comfortable and to have time to contribute. Virtual meeting platforms now have break room capabilities. Maybe you ask each small group to address a different topic. Or maybe you ask each group to decide on what's most important to them to discuss. Or you can put folks in pairs and have a listener record a speaker and then share their partner's thoughts back with the larger group. Sometimes small groups are not the answer. What about giving a large group 5 minutes of silence so each person can reflect and record their thoughts for themselves or in a way to share back with the larger group? Remember, introverts need thinking time to process and contribute. And so you build this in. Maybe you have the whole group working collectively on an online shared digital document in real time. These are just some examples to give you a sense of how creative you can be in soliciting feedback from everyone on the team and how you can level that playing field. If you're in person, you can also use movement to keep things lively. You could have folks stand up, move to this corner if you agree, move to this corner if you disagree. They can also move to specified locations in the room to express their choice or opinion without actually having to speak. Maybe you let them self-organize according to categories of interest. There are so many ways that you can be creative in a group setting. You can do some similar things online with the built-in tools that video conferencing applications have. They have the raise hand feature. Zoom has a thing where you can say only show folks with video on, and so folks can turn their video on and off to indicate their contribution to the discussion. Now, if you want everyone to have a chance to answer a question or share an idea, ask them to answer in the round. Now, in a group setting, in an in-person setting, this is straightforward. Online, maybe it means that you go alphabetically. But what this does is it ensures that everyone has a chance to speak, and it helps those who need time to prepare to know where they are in line. Always be explicit that passing is allowed. We're not trying to force anybody to contribute if they don't want to, but you're like holding a space for them when it's their turn, and they don't have to think about, how am I going to interject? Now, if you're online or in person, you can use something that I call like a tennis ball method, and that is that the speaker tosses the ball to or chooses who's going to speak next. Now, this can work online. If in a small group, 8 to 10 people, it's a little bit hard to keep track of who has spoken and who hasn't, but a good moderator is going to be keeping track of that. Now, if you're okay with only a few contributions from the group, you could also use popcorn style. This is where folks speak when they're moved, but they only speak once. Have you ever been in a meeting where the participants were told you only get to speak once? This is novel, right? But it really helps steer those folks who tend to dominate toward more inclusive behaviors. Okay, you can also use polls or surveys or Google Forms right inside your meeting. You have it set up ahead of time, and you give folks enough time to fill it out during the meeting. This is a way to get 100% participation. In fact, elevating written components should have its own place on this list. The things I mentioned, polls, surveys, Google Forms, note cards, stickies, the idea is that you're trying to capture the opinions and thoughts of your participants. It's critical data that you want to capture. If you're using just your voice, there isn't time in a meeting for every person to speak their thoughts. But if everyone is writing at once, it becomes a much more efficient way of gathering a lot of data to use this written element. And it serves multiple purposes. It can help those who are more visually inclined, and it can act as a record of things discussed or accomplished. If you're in person, this might mean that you scribe or record contributions. As folks in the audience are saying things, you're writing it down on a whiteboard or a flip chart. You can also do this online using a digital artifact for recording or for collaboration. When you put folks in small groups, you can ask for a volunteer for a note taker, or you can assign one. You're the moderator. Now, there will be times that things don't go as you'd hoped, and one of your best skills as a moderator is to be flexible and willing to pivot. If something isn't working, scrap it, try something else. Be agile. When you have a wide range of tools and methods in your moderator toolbox, you can easily pivot to another technique. Turn your creative juices on, and remember, you are responsible for the outcome of the meeting. Okay, now your toolbox is well equipped, and it's time to start planning the meeting. I cannot overstate the importance of establishing a really clear objective for your meeting. Without this, everything else becomes much more difficult. A clear objective with a solid idea of expected outcomes is paramount. What do you want to convey? What do you hope to achieve or learn? What do you want participants to share or to come away with? If you're working with a group of people and it isn't clear what the objective of a meeting should be, you could crowdsource it. You could run a brainstorming session about what topics folks want to discuss, and then have everyone vote. Now you have a list of topics to work from, And when the list gets low, you can repeat the exercise. If you aren't sure what the objective is or how to discover it, maybe cancel the meeting. You're going to get a lot of love for that. Now, next is crafting the schedule or the structure of the meeting. There are several considerations you need to take into account beforehand. How much time is needed to reach your objective? How many participants will there be? A really critical aspect to planning your meeting is budgeting your time wisely. And this is directly related to the number of people participating and your clear objective. Do you know how long it takes for 20 people to introduce themselves? It can take an hour. That's 3 minutes apiece. I could talk about myself and my life and my hobbies and my interests and my career for more than 3 minutes. If you create a structured prompt, please tell us your name, how long you've been here, and your favorite vegetable. Now you might get it down to 15 minutes. If you also create a structured order, for instance, going in the round or going alphabetically or posting by a list of, or according to a list of names that you've posted in the video chat, you might get this down to 10 minutes. Now, this is just one example to show you the power of creating structure while considering your participants and allotted time, all to help you achieve that clear objective. Now, there are many ways to creatively design and combine the strategies that you're going to use to achieve your desired outcome. If your objective is simply to disseminate information, the structure of your meeting will be fairly straightforward. And I would argue could maybe just be an email. If, however, you want to gather feedback, gauge interest, or make sure participants have an increased understanding of a concept or a topic, then you need to design a meeting that's going to achieve all of those goals. So let's say you have a clear objective, you've planned the structure of the meeting. This can then be translated into your agenda, which you should publish as early as possible. Your introverts need time outside of the meeting to think deeply about the topics before they'll be prepared to contribute to the discussion. When introverts are listening, they're listening deeply. They're not preparing their response. Remember, you want to know what the introverts on your team are thinking, and every team is comprised of 30 to 50% introverts. Now, another thing you want to consider before the meeting are logistics. Is your meeting in person? How much space do you need? Please don't invite 12 people to a meeting room with a table and 6 chairs. Don't do that. This does not make everyone feel like they're on equal footing, with some at the table and some squeezed into the corners of the room. Are you going to ask folks to break into smaller groups? Do you have enough space to move chairs around? What about supplies? Do you need sticky notes, poster paper, whiteboard, pens? This all depends on the meeting structure that you've planned. Now, will you have folks participating remotely? I have to tell you, a hybrid meeting with some folks remote and some folks in person is a place where inclusion really takes a hit. You want each person to be able to see and or hear each participant. Otherwise, you're asking for disengagement. Plan to level the playing field and have each person use their own laptop, even if that means muting and unmuting when you speak. You can test and check the audio beforehand to see how it's all going to work. Okay, the meeting is planned. You've set the structure. You're ready to begin. Now comes a very critical step that moderators sometimes forget to think about, and that is setting the tone. You are responsible for setting the tone. Don't neglect this aspect. Be clear with yourself what your own intentions are ahead of time. A moderator is not there to get their point across. If that's your intention, write an email. Your intention is to stay committed to the desired outcome of the meeting. That's critical. And your intentions impact the tone of the meeting from the very beginning. So start the meeting by stating the purpose of the meeting. I think I forgot to hit a click here. There we go. State the purpose of the meeting and reiterate your objectives and your planned agenda. Another important element to setting an inclusive tone is introductions and or icebreakers. If there are less than 10 or 12 people present and you think some might not know each other, start with quick introductions. Hopefully you've planned for this. Learning folks' names, how to pronounce them correctly, is key to building an inclusive environment. Now, icebreakers might seem cheesy. Okay, they definitely are cheesy, but they serve such an important role in a meeting. They're effective at lightening the mood, but here's what they really do. They get each person to contribute something small early on. And trust is built as we get to know each other. Icebreakers are a very low barrier way to get each person to use their voice right at the start of a meeting. This helps set the tone and set the expectation of everyone participating. Now, in some cases, it can also be helpful to set ground rules or develop group agreements. I think I did those out of order. My apologies. Once established, these can be periodically reviewed and should be consistently reinforced by the moderator. Things like not interrupting or not speaking twice before everyone else has had a chance to speak are sometimes important to call out. So now we've talked about the tone of the meeting, and now we make the magic of the meeting happen. As you live into your intention to be an effective moderator during the meeting, be aware and observant and watch for patterns. Historically excluded folks speak less and are interrupted more. Introverts rarely interrupt, and those who are newer to the company or have fewer years of experience may need special encouragement. When meetings exclude some voices, the benefit of the diversity on your team is squandered. Steering the discussion. Now, hopefully the planning and the structure that you've put in place, along with those ground rules, will keep the meeting proceeding toward its natural conclusion, and you'll meet your stated objective. We are humans, though, and sometimes the best laid plans go awry. So, keeping the meeting objective as your guide, even if it gets awkward, it is your job to keep the meeting heading in the right direction. That means taking the wheel and not letting go. You might need to interrupt someone. You might need to thank them for their observation or contribution and then restate the objective of the meeting. You might need to change tack altogether and move towards small groups or silent writing. The responsibility is on you to steer the discussion toward the objective. Now, the next one is tougher than it sounds, minding the time. This means you might have to interrupt someone who's long-winded to make sure everyone has time to contribute. Maybe you decide to let one part of the meeting go longer than planned because it feels really important or productive. That means then that you have to cut or shorten some other part. Now, as you build your experience and your instinct as a moderator, this will become easier. You won't always get it right, but you can always learn from the times you get it wrong. Minding the time also relates to starting and stopping meetings on time. Folks have other commitments, and especially stopping on time is a way to honor and respect their presence. You have to be courageous. Being an effective moderator requires courage. Courage to interrupt, to make space for others, to shut down rude or inappropriate behavior in a way that sets very clear boundaries without shaming, to stick to the schedule, to make split-second decisions about when to move on and when to make space. You need to have the ability to acknowledge mistakes, retrace your steps, maybe even move backward in the meeting to correct a misstep. Let your responsibility for the outcome of the meeting bolster your courage. Okay, if you can believe it, I have a few more tips and tricks. The first one is to remain neutral. As a moderator, we can get really invested in the conversation and what's going on, but you're not there for that. You're not there as a participant. You have a whole different set of role, like your role and your responsibilities are completely different than the participants. You have to remain neutral. The other thing is that you're listening and clarifying. This means you have to be a really good listener and a really good question asker, because what you want to do is steer that discussion. And so you're asking these clarifying questions because you're listening deeply. This is the job of a moderator, to keep things on track. Okay, this is my most favorite tip, and I'm not sure why it's at this place on the list, but basically, silence is your friend. Silence lets people think about things. It lets things marinate. It lets folks gather their courage to speak up or participate. It allows that deep thinking to happen. It allows us to make connections in our mind without being distracted by what we're missing if we're not listening. Silence is highly underutilized. Okay, I'm going to tell you this one thing. If you're in a meeting and you're noticing that the same folks keep contributing, a really effective strategy is to say, we're going to pause and we're going to wait for folks who have not yet contributed to say something. And then you just wait. Now you have to be comfortable. Some people feel awkward with silence, but as a moderator, you are not going to budge. You are not going to move on until someone who hasn't contributed speaks up. And I promise you, you can find me anywhere on the internet. I promise you this will happen. People who haven't yet spoken will speak up when there is silence. It's a beautiful thing to see happen. Okay, my last one is to experiment. If you get a wild idea about some strategy you could use in a meeting, try it out. Make mistakes and learn from them. Okay, now, there are some after the meeting things that you should think about. One is, do you need a follow-up? Do you need another meeting? Did you finish what you were doing? Do you need to reschedule, continue, etc.? Remember your clear objective? That's what you're working towards. Maybe you didn't quite reach it. Maybe there's more work to do. Maybe something else spun out of the meeting that you think needs to be addressed. Following up with action items and highlights from the meeting is a really important way to sort of get closure, to make sure that folks know what to do next with the experience that they had in your meeting. I would say that publishing all the data you collected, all the notes that were taken, is a gift to the organization, to the team, to the history of the conversations that have happened around the topic. This is an important thing for a moderator to do after the fact. The next thing is to reflect on your meeting. How did it go? What really worked and why? What didn't work and why? How are you going to handle it differently next time? And then you get to start planning your next meeting. Okay, some folks have said, what if I'm not the moderator? How can I make any of this happen? When you are invited to a meeting, ask what the objective is. Help them make sure they know what they're trying to accomplish. Ask for the agenda ahead of time. I have friends who will decline a meeting without an agenda and not explain why. Ask for the agenda. There are lots of things you can do during a meeting to support inclusivity. If you have a chance or you feel like you can speak up, use that energy to ask someone who hasn't spoken yet what their thoughts are. Make space, make openings. Guess what else anybody can do? You can interrupt the interrupter. Anybody here ever done that? Have you ever said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear I'd love to hear what they were saying. There's lots of ways you could phrase this. I could probably talk 10 minutes about ways to interrupt interrupters. Anybody can do that. Interrupt the person who's interrupted, return the moment to the original speaker. If the discussion has gotten off track, you can jump in with a question to help realign the meeting objective. Aren't questions powerful? Questions can be very useful. And as a meeting participant, you can use questions to help build inclusivity. Alternatively, you could volunteer to moderate. Okay, final thoughts. I hope I was able to convey the importance of the moderator's commitment to the meeting objective and to the running of the meeting. When everyone is able to contribute, to be heard, to feel included, then you reap the full benefits of the diversity on your team. And I have witnessed the impact of inclusive meetings. It is transformative. When you have an environment where everyone has a chance to contribute, all voices have an equal weight, and it's safe to share your thoughts and opinions, you have a team with a deep sense of belonging, and that is the definition of inclusivity. Thank you so much for your time today.